Hello and welcome to ASCD's Whole Child Symposium. ASCD is an education association working for the success of each learner with a strong commitment to a whole child approach to learning. Our programs, products and advocacy focus on learning, teaching and leading always with the student at the centre. This stream is coming to you direct from the night studio at the museum in beautiful Washington, DC. And if you hear some people in the background making noise walking up, it's because parking in Washington, DC at this time of year is very difficult. So we have some people coming into the studio as we start. I'm Sean Slade. I'm the Director of Whole Child Programs at ASCD. And I'm both of you to welcome you and also as your host for the next 3 hours. We have 2 exciting panels discussing this spring topic. You can also follow along, as you probably are already, on ascd.org/WC Symposium, and follow along and ask questions on the hashtag that you see on the slide in front of you, which is WCS15. The purpose of our Whole Child Symposium, this is the 3rd one we've done now, starting in spring of last year, is really to be proactive in the education debate as opposed to reactive, to discuss the most relevant issues needing to be discussed. And one thing that I think is key and strong about this symposium is really putting educators back in front of the education debate. So what you'll find is on all of our symposia, we have people who are involved in education, either as researchers or authors, administrators, association directors, executive directors, and of course school teachers and classroom teachers. Additionally, these symposia make sure that we maintain a focus on what we think is key at ASCD, and that's a focus on the whole child. I mentioned a minute ago that this is the 3rd of our Whole Child Symposia, and the theme for this one is poverty and education. What we can do around poverty as a sector, what we can do as a school, and also what we can do as a classroom, and how we can ameliorate the effects of education and learning, and what we can do to better address the issues. And I mentioned this is the 3rd one. The one last year, back in spring of 2014, the inaugural one, looked at the future of education and choosing your tomorrow today. Decisions that we can make today that will have an impact in the future. And in our fall symposia, and the report just came out a couple of weeks ago, was on teacher leadership, what we can do about promoting and developing teachers as leaders in the classroom. All the information around these symposia are on the same website that you're watching this live stream today, ascd.org/WC Symposia. But for this topic, why did we choose poverty? Why did we choose this as the topic for spring that we think is most key to be discussed? Well, really, it's difficult to ignore or argue against the effects that poverty have across society and, of course, across education. As you see in front of you on the slide, Charles Blow stated in the New York Times that there are corrosive cruelties of childhood poverty, things such as worsening health and educational outcomes, impaired cognitive development, and the effects of toxic stress on brain functions. But there is, unfortunately, another reason why this topic is not only critical, but timely. And I'm sure many of you have seen these headline reports over the last couple of months. The majority of public school students across the US are now living in poverty. As the author of this study, who we are honoured to have as one of our panellists, wrote, low-income students are now a majority of the school children attending the nation's public schools. And the latest data collected show that 51% of the students across the nation's public schools were low income in 2013. In 40 of the 50 states, low-income students comprise no less than 40% of all public school children. and in 21 states, low-income children were the majority in 2013. But there's also another reason why this topic is unfortunately timely and also key to be discussed. 51 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 launched what has been called the War on Poverty. And he said at that time, unfortunately, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of their poverty and some because of their colour, and all too many because of both. And our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. This administration today, and this was 1964, declares unconditional war on poverty in America, and I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. He went on, it will not be a short or easy struggle, and no single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth cannot afford to win it. We can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a link with the two things that I've summarised just there. And the link is 51. 51 years since the launch of the War on Poverty, and 51% of public school students now come from poverty. Now, this is not just a moral issue, and even that should be enough for us to make changes, but it's also an educational issue. Because poverty affects learning. It affects brain development. There was a recent study, as reported in the Washington Post and published in Nature Neuroscience, that outlined the physical and cognitive differences between children and adolescents and their brains depending on socioeconomic backgrounds. Children in families who earned less than $25,000 a year had 6% less surface area than those whose families earned $150,000 or more. Poor children also scored lower on the battery of cognitive tests. Now, we could have had a whole symposium on brain development and poverty. We have enough authors at ASCD. We have enough authors out there in the publishing world. But we want to look at what we can do about poverty in this discussion. Poverty also affects learning and affects the resources that are available. Whether that be photocopy paper, textbooks, the condition of facilities, through to having social workers, or even getting beyond teaching just language arts and math, which is something that we promote at ASCD, a more holistic whole child approach to education. But many schools don't have funds to employ a physical education teacher, an art teacher, a music teacher. Poverty can also affect learning and the resources that schools get. This report came out from the Hetchinger report, and it shows that wealthier schools and districts and neighbourhoods continue to garner more funds and have more access to opportunities. And the achievement gap too often is highlighting both an economic gap and an opportunity gap. The richest 25% of schools receiving more than 15% more funding from state and local governments per student than the poorest 25%. And that was a report that came out this year in March. And with all of these other influences on the child and on learning also affects outcomes. The latest PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment from the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which we've heard so much about over the last couple of years, stated that poverty can explain up to 46% of PISA scores in OECD countries. However, it went on, and it said, if unaddressed. if unaddressed. If we do not address poverty as it relates to our children's ability to learn, then it seems like we are going to bear the consequences of not dealing with it. So if unaddressed, and that last phrase is what we are doing here today, hopefully addressing or discussing or starting conversations about the effects of poverty and what we can start to do about them as educators. Before we start in earnest though, let me run through very quickly a brief outline of today's structure. We have two panels, one focusing on the research, the findings, and our systems, and they'll be up here very shortly. The other on what we can do in the schools and the classrooms to ameliorate poverty's effects. There'll be a very brief question and answer after each of the panels, and then at the end we'll bring all 6 panellists back together for a larger Q&A session. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first panel, and I'd ask them to come and join me here on the stage. We have Tiffany Anderson. She is the superintendent of the Jennings School District in Jennings, Missouri, a public school administrator for the past 18 years, and she is committed to eliminating the achievement gap that contributes to the cycle of generational poverty. She has improved achievement and closed achievement gaps in rural, urban and suburban public school districts. And she was also, I might point out, an Education Week leader to watch as well. So welcome, Tiffany. We also have in the middle Judy Seltz, and Judy is the Executive Director of ASCD. She formerly served as the Chief Officer of Constituent Services and the Deputy Executive Director. In that capacity, she directed the association's work with its affiliates and other constituent groups in the US and across the globe, and also involved with public policy, governments, and the Whole Child. Welcome, Judy. And last but not least, we have Steve Suits. He is the Senior Fellow of the Southern Education Foundation, the nation's oldest education foundation, founded in 1867 to advance fairness and excellence in education. He is the author of more than 125 books, articles and monographs, including the series of publications concerning the growth and challenges of low-income students in the South and the nation. And his most recent report, as we mentioned before, was a new majority research bulletin, Low-Income Students Now a Majority in the Nation's Public Schools. So please join me in welcoming our guests. As I take my seat as well. So, Steve, let me start with you. Given the report that you authored earlier this year, which placed poverty onto the front pages of many newspapers and magazines, I think it's appropriate to start around that topic and set the scene of where we are in the US regarding poverty and education. And we have a couple of key quotes that you'll be able to see on our monitor from your report, which in essence state that for the first time, majority of public school children in the US come from low socioeconomic households. You state, as I mentioned before, that for the first time in recent history, a majority of the school children attending the nation's public schools come from low-income families, 51%. And the pattern, as you point out, was spread across the nation. And this defining moment in enrolment in public education in the US comes as a consequence of steadily growing trend that has persisted over several decades. You pointed out that in 1989, less than 32% of students were low income. By 2000, it was over 38%. By 2006, the national rate was 42%. And after the Great Recession, the rate climbed in 2011 to 48%. And then unfortunately, in 2013, that rate crossed the threshold to become 51%. So Steve, you've called this a defining moment. Can you outline what you mean by this and how you, and I suppose the country, has come to this point?
Sure. Well, it's a defining moment because we've reached the juncture in our public schools where the education of low-income students is not simply a matter of equity and fairness. It's a matter of our national future. Because when one group becomes the majority of our students, they define what that future is going to be in education more than any other group. And so we not only at this moment have to think about, is it fair? Is it right that we have an education system in which some students, because of their income, do not get the education that they need to be good citizens? But we also have to say, what's that going to mean for the country as a whole? Because this is the majority now. We got here, I think, in large part because that war on poverty 51 years ago came to a screeching halt in the early 1970s. And by the 1980s, in this country, the war on poverty became, as I said in the 1980s, a war on the poor. We had massive cutbacks in the programs that were to uplift poor families and low-income families. And so by the late 1980s, we began to see this clear growth in the return of a substantial number of low-income students enrolled in the public schools. And it has continued, and it will continue. So we have in the public schools, we have seen what has been, in my judgment, the consequences of failed social and economic policies. And that doesn't mean that social and economic policies have to change in order for us to do a better job in the schools with educating low-income students. But it does mean that we have to have a system that can work for them.
On the positive, however, this defining moment has received attention. Like your report has been highlighted on, as we pointed out before, the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, went overseas as well. So at least the positive is this is not a report that's been hidden from anybody and that's actually out there and being discussed. But I suppose the problem also is that you've been talking about this for a while. Yeah. And when I did your introduction, it was highlighted that your organisation focuses primarily on the southern states. And this has been a trend that we've been seeing occurring in the southern states for a number of years. So another quote that you had that I saw from a 2006 report that you wrote, that you said, currently the South alone faces the implications and consequences of having a new majority of low-income students in its public schools. And the South also faces a new global economy that requires higher skills and knowledge from all who seek a decent living. And in this brave new world, the people and policymakers in southern states must realise that continuing the current uneven level of education progress will be disastrous. It seems that they haven't taken those words to heed and made many changes, or at least the changes have not been that successful. You went on in that same little passage to be quite strident, and I like people who are strident and say the truth and put it out there.
Comes from being a Southerner.
Comes from being a Southerner? Okay. That you said they must understand that more fully that today their future and their grandchildren's future are inextricably bound to the success or failure of low-income students in the South. And if this new majority of students fail in our school, an entire state or an entire region will fail simply because there will be inadequate human capital in southern states to build and sustain good jobs, an enjoyable quality of life, and a well-informed democracy. It's that simple. Now, this question may sound redundant, but where do you see this trend line? Because you've talked about this in southern states, and we highlighted the trend line nationally previously. So where will we be in 10 or 20 years if nothing happens?
I don't think we're going to be heading in any different direction unless we have some profound systemic changes in economic policy, social policy, and education policy and practice. The trend accelerated due to the Great Recession, but that was simply an acceleration of a trend that, as Sean has said, has been going on for decades. And it's going to continue, and it means that there will be no place in the United States, if there are, and there still are a few, but there will be no place in the United States where this is not the pivotal issue of public education and of the community's future. In an analysis we did in a recent report based on 2011 data, we documented that even in suburban America, 2 out of 5 students are low income. This is not a big city problem. This is not a rural problem. It is a problem that the United States of America's public schools have, and it's not going to go away till we make some profound systemic changes. We have a system in which and have had for a long time, probably since the origins of the Republic, we have a system of financing of education in this country, which in result means that the students who have the greatest needs get the least resources. Now, you could argue when you've got a community of 1 out of 5 low-income students that that's just unfair. And it still is unfair even when you have a majority of your students who are low income. But when that happens, that means that things begin ultimately to affect the community as a whole in ways that no one can escape. It may be indirect, but much of it can be very direct in terms of what's the life trajectory of someone who does not get a good education in this country. You don't need to know that because you already know it. The country, when you have a majority of folks who are not going to be well educated, and as you know, just look at the National Assessment of Education Progress, look at the gap on 4th grade reading between low-income students and wealthier students. And that gap has been pretty well solid since NAEP began, and it hasn't changed. Now, the fact is, if you look at that chart, what you got to realize is the folks on the bottom are now the majority. And that trend in educational achievement has been solidly flat with a huge difference, some say almost 2 grades difference in 4th grade reading. Now, if you have that as what is the fact of life in schools, and you continue to have, as we will, the increase in the lowest performing students, that is going to be a system that fails. And if public education in this country fails, despite the critics of public education, if public education in this country fails, the nation fails. And that is the message we have to come to grips with.
I think that point you make about the majority almost becoming the new normal is something we need to take heed about, because all of a sudden then we don't start to realise what the effects of poverty are, because those effects become the norm out there. Judy, let me turn to you, because I mentioned it before and you indicated in a recent editorial that this defining moment comes alongside the anniversary of another defining moment, 51 years since the War on Poverty. And this was a landmark legislation that focused attention and resources towards poverty, including the expansion of Social Security and creation of Medicare, and of course, ESEA and Title I schools. I'm curious to hear what your reaction would be about these two aligning, defining moments right now.
I think what's interesting in looking is that the 50-year mark is obviously an opportunity to reflect and to look at what's changed as a result of those two major pieces of legislation. And I would have to echo much of what Steve has said. In large part, I think about the change in the mood and the commitment of the nation as a whole to educating every child. I think that there was a brief moment at the beginning and a few years of the war on poverty when there really was a national commitment to changing the lives of poor people. I think there was a sense that we were in this together, that unless we could really make this war on poverty work, that we would all fail. And then, we're not going to talk too much politics this afternoon, but there was a shift, and it became okay to have a war on poor people instead of a war on poverty. It became okay to change the national dialogue so that it was no longer a discussion of the supports that people needed, but it's their fault if they tried harder. It became, I think, and I remember this clearly, it was a pretty ugly time of national discourse. And so I look at this 50-year mark as an opportunity to look back and see if we can't do this again, do it differently, do it better, and work with some persistence across communities with a real commitment to each child and each family. If we don't, I share Steve's pessimistic view that the public education is so entangled with our future economic development and health that if we don't fix public education for every kid who walks through the door, it's a really bleak future.
And it's interesting that both you and Steve have mentioned that this changed from a war on poverty to a war on poor people. And that's a fairly fundamental shift in the mindset of whether it's the public or whether it's politicians and whether it's policymakers. Tiffany, let's turn to you. We've heard the phrase before that demographics are not destiny. But based on these latest poverty results, it appears too often that it is that sometimes. And I mentioned those OECD PISA results before about you can attribute poverty to 46% of those results if unaddressed. And we have that quote up on the slide as well. Now, granted, that report didn't highlight the effects of poverty to shine a light on that, but they actually shone a light on it to show that educators and the public can do something, can address these issues. There was, in fact, a subsequent article by Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, Director of Education and Skills, that he stressed the effects of poverty can be ameliorated. And he went on to say that education systems where disadvantaged students succeed are able to moderate social inequities. They tend to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and the most capable school leaders to the most disadvantaged schools, thus challenging all students with high standards, excellent teachings. He doesn't go on, but I'm assuming also adequate resources, both educationally and socially. So Tiffany, demographics may not be destiny unless we do nothing. And if we do nothing, then children's future are determined by their zip code and their bank accounts. But what avenues are open to us as a sector or as a district to truly combat these effects of poverty?
Well, you know, I think there are two pieces. One, systematic oppression is real. And so there are certainly systems that are in place that oppress students that are in poverty that are difficult to navigate. But if you get yourself sandwiched into the conversation about resources being too low and standards being too high, you will never move. Resources will remain low, standards will remain high, standards should be high. And so I'm here to really say that you get out of the conversation of resources are too low. It is true that there are systematic oppressive systems in place that really work against not only schools that are high poverty schools, but that work against all schools. And so funds that are intended for students that are in poverty are not getting to the students that are in poverty because of the regulations and guidelines that are in place, and Title is a perfect example of that. Now, that being said, and I'll be real practical because I'm sure there are teachers in the audience and principals that are listening, and so I'm going to give some practical kinds of things that can be done, and I'll speak from a system standpoint, but to say here's what that looks like. I believe from the classroom to the school level to the district level, there are three things that you have to tackle in order to move any school, classroom, or district. I have found them to be true as a teacher, or principal, and as superintendent, and most of my career has been as superintendent, and they don't change in any district I've been in. Relationships, pedagogy, curriculum. Those are the three things. Pedagogy, though, that's your teachers. Who's in front of the kids and what are they teaching them? That's the first thing. Curriculum, and aligned standards-based curriculum. So if you have no money and you can't buy textbooks, the curriculum can be the world in front of you, the online items, the things that teachers create who had nothing to create them with but their own hands. So, I mean, that whole aligned standards-based, not teaching to a test, not teaching to a textbook, but teaching to the standard. And everybody can do that. And then the last one, which is the most important one, is relationships. And so that's relationships between student to student, student to teacher, principal to teacher. And I will tell you why that's important. Kids will work hard for you if they trust you, they won't if they don't. Guess what? Adults are the same way. And even if achievement reaches a certain level, it will stop at that level and not go beyond that if relationships are not strong. So people tease me when they first see me in tennis shoes, and I have heels in the car. I don't know what the last year was that I wore heels, but I have heels in the car, but I don't ever wear them because we have to remember as superintendents and as leaders that we're teachers. You know, forget the title, you're teachers. So when you start talking about poverty and how do you handle that, let me talk about what that looks like in those three areas very briefly, and then turn it back over to you. Under the relationships piece, the first thing we do when teachers start with us, we take them on a home visit. We have one bus, they show up, the bus shows up the first day, I greet the teachers, I know all of my teachers by name, I interview everybody, it could be the custodian, I want to meet everybody that works for us, it could be a coach that works part-time. That's a relationship piece, I want to know your story, what brought you here, and will you stay and what will make you leave, because in high poverty places, people sometimes get in there and say, I give up, too hard, didn't know. And so we're really thoughtful about who we select. And so with that relationship piece, we go and we knock at the door and we say, hey, I'm Tiffany Anderson, your child's teacher for next year, or either I may introduce them and we have someone with them. We give them a backpack of supplies and we tell them how excited we are. Do you know how we pick those homes? We pick the highest poverty. We pick the student that might be homeless. We pick the family that may have had the greatest difficulties. We pick the child that's been suspended the most, which often is the highest poverty. Jennings is 91% free reduced lunch, 98% African-American students. It's one of the highest poverty, highest minority districts in St. Louis, and it's what drew me there. Partially, my family lives in St. Louis, that's the other part. So the relationship piece is huge. Then we bring the teachers back, and we talk about what did you see on those home visits? You may have seen a dim home where you don't have a lot of bright light. A home with no colors, and so when they come into your classroom, if you're going to decorate with all these colors and things, kids may just be jumping off the wall. You'll be saying something's wrong with the kids. No, it's something wrong with you and what you did with that classroom. So we talk about how do you greet your students and how do you build a relationship. So that's one piece. Relationships in terms of our families. You know, the first time I had a PTO meeting, and it started when I was a principal at Clark. There we had 99% African-American students, 100% poverty in St. Louis City. And I had a PTO and no one showed up. And then when I went to the principal's meeting and said, no one showed up. And a lot of principals said, they don't come. And so I asked my parents, mother, and I call all my parents mother or dad, you know, mother, why isn't anybody showing up at my PTO meeting? Well, we have to do laundry, we have to, you know, find a job. And so it started as a principal, but it continues as a superintendent. We have a washer and dryer in every school. If you want to visit your child's class, you get one load of laundry for free a day. We give you all the items that you need in exchange for 1 hour of volunteerism. Groceries, we give groceries out. You want to have a PTO that's full, any principal, any teacher that's out there, get a 50-pound bag of groceries, and I will guarantee you that there is an organization that's willing to partner. We have the St. Louis Food Bank. We opened up a pantry in our district. That's a relationship piece, but it addresses poverty. And the curriculum piece kind of speaks for itself, making sure that you don't use resources and not having that as an excuse as to why you don't teach kids the standard. You just have to be more creative. So those three things are critical, and that gives you some really concrete ways to kind of get around some of the issues that we face that we know are there. You cannot get sandwiched into the conversation that resources are too small and parents aren't involved. That is reality. But we can control the environment in our classrooms in a way that helps lessen that opportunity and access gap.
Exactly. I love the way you put relationships first. And anyone that's heard me on our Whole Child podcast or heard me speak, I'm amazed about, one, coming from a youth development background where I studied resilience and connectedness. It was around relationships. Relationships are key. But I'm amazed very often how often the word relationship comes up, whether you're talking about academic achievement, whether you're talking about at-risk youth, whether you're talking about drug and alcohol abuse, whether you're talking about trying to develop anything with young people, the term developing relationships comes up. It's not just, it is knowing who they are, but it's also providing those support networks around your community.
Sean, I listened with great admiration to Tiffany's analysis of the system of a school or a school district. And I understand why she takes the view that this is the reality we have to deal with. I would, though, like to see the same kind of rigorous analysis done for the systems we have in place as to why aren't they working well for low-income students, and what do we need to do in the systems of state education that we have. And I think if we had that kind of analysis for state systems of education, that reality might get a little better under which you work in the systems of a district.
It's interesting, the successful schools that you see out there, or the successful districts you see out there, are the ones that have very often broken down those barriers between what a school typically used to look like or what they typically used to do. You talked about having a laundry in your school. You talked about making home visits to families. When those things start to happen, you start to break down the barriers of whose responsibility it is and actually understand that all of these students are our students. Let me raise another little question, because Judy touched on this before as well, but this conversation is bringing it into it. There was a book by Robert Putnam just recently called Our Kids. He was the author that put out the wonderful Bowling Alone last decade as well. And the cliff notes, or the synopsis of the book, is that he thinks we're moving away as a society from seeing everybody as our kids, and we're moving towards this more myopic view of our kids are those kids in front of me, or literally they're our kids that live in my neighbourhood, my street and my house. I want to get your reaction of that idea from anybody.
I think that that's true, because we can customize the news that we get. You know, you don't any longer have to flip the pages of a paper newspaper every day and maybe happen on an article that you wouldn't have read. You can customize your Washington Post or your New York Times and read only the articles that you choose to, only the topics you wish to explore, only the columnists that you wish to read, and perhaps people deliberately choose columnists that they disagree with, but I'll bet that most people read people who affirm their own perspective. So I think it's easier to be blind to a lot of diversity around us. And I think that it makes it very easy, either in gated communities or communities that may be right next to each other but are different school districts. They may have very different funding structures. It's very, very easy to not see, either because they're truly not near you or because you can be willfully blind, not see people who are living very different lives from you but very nearby.
I think there's also a sense of competition that creates this division between my kids and other kids. Every parent, every grandparent, every uncle and aunt wants that child that they care about to succeed. And getting them in the right kindergarten, the right school district, all of that is a very family-based decision that is generally on the view that somewhere up above, when they get out of public schools, they're going to have to compete for an entrance into a college, and that really is when their child needs to be able to win this game of competition. If we look at what's happened in college completion since the 1970s, we see that low-income students have had about a flat rate of 8 to 10% over that almost 40-year period. The top quartile has almost doubled the rate of college graduation. So long as we see education as a competition, ultimately for that ultimate good of that college degree, and we don't see that this country benefits when we vastly expand the number of people who have college degrees, we're going to have this them and us. Whether we say it or not, we're going to do it. And we have to come to terms with the fact that we're not competing with each other in this country for scarce jobs. It is true that a high school, somebody with college, some college and no degree, compared to a college graduate, is today worse off in comparison to that college graduate than a high school dropout was in the 1970s. In other words, the value of some college but no degree is about what the value in the early 70s were of a high school dropout. That's the way the economy has given a premium to higher education. That fuels our notion that we've got to help our own. But what we don't quite yet come to terms with is the whole country has to improve a lot more folks if we're going to have in a global economy a competitive workforce.
You know, one of the, and I said I wasn't going to do this today, but I absolutely love reading Martin Luther King. And one of the quotes he has, and anyone who knows me has probably heard this quote, it's from John Donne from The Bell Tolls. I cannot do well until you do well. You can't do well until I do well. And the piece of that piece that I love to kind of think about is that student who doesn't graduate, that impoverished student, that will be that young person that becomes the criminal that holds you up at your house. And so that whole piece of, I don't think people choose a life of crime. I don't think they choose a life of drugs. In most cases, I think it's poverty that drives them to that, which is why the educational institution has to be the driver to close that gap. It's really not an option not to do that. I would come back to that comment that you mentioned about the analysis of the system. That has been done so many times. If you bring a bunch of superintendents together, they can tell you right now what's broken with the system in terms of policy for education and what can be fixed. It's almost as though we're screaming and no one is listening. And so whether you can go online right now and Google Title I and ways that it's unfair. Just put that in your Google search and I guarantee you'll get a bunch of articles that tell you how Title I is so broken and that how people that are the richest get more money than the places that are the poorest. And how you have to whole supplant and supplement and just so many different rules that reduce the flexibility. So the money looks like it's there, but the flexibility isn't there to use it how you need to use it. And people laugh at me because I think this year I said, okay, I wrote Obama again, and I haven't gotten a response yet. And we're border Ferguson. And so we're where the command center is. And so part of our district overlaps Ferguson. And so I've written him to say we're in Ferguson. I would just love a listening ear from someone who actually can help fix the policies that can be fixed. So how often do they bring a think tank of urban superintendents, small and large, and rural superintendents and teachers that can just tell you right off just like that, here are the things that are broken that need to be fixed. It is truly that simplistic. Absent of people listening, we have just said in our district, in fact, I was meeting with administrators, the high school administrators yesterday, and said, okay, we will have 100% of our graduates that will either have a job, and we must find them the job. They said, we're finding them the job, we're finding them the job. Or they will go to college, technical school, or the military. 100%. We have 4 weeks left. We must get it done. It is not an option not to, because that is generational poverty. So if we do not break generational poverty, and I believe everybody, everybody goes to school. It used to be church. Everybody goes to school, not everybody goes to church. So we have this incredible opportunity to truly break generational poverty. Now, here's one other note about how we're doing that. 30% of our staff are people who live in Jennings. Why do I do that? Because we're breaking generational poverty. So I'm not waiting for a system or a person or someone to come give us jobs. No, we say, okay, if you are an alumni or you're a resident and you live in this community, you will have greater opportunity to get a job here, and we're going to employ you. And if we can't find you a job, we have partnered with other people who will find you a job. That is our duty as a school system to do that. So there are just so many examples how you have to work around that, or you will have not only a local and state problem, but certainly a national problem. The achievement gap is really an economic gap. It's about reducing opportunity and access to people. That's what it is. And if you can increase access and opportunity in the most creative of ways, you will at least have some islands of excellence, unfortunately so, islands of excellence that are moving this academic needle.
It sounds like you're trying to make your school, or you're not trying, you are making your school district really the hub of that community, where services come in, where people that want information come to them, and you can start to provide the right services to all of your students and all of your families there as well. Let's go back to the point you were making about Title I. If you can do it briefly, how would you fix Title I? What would be the change? More flexibility?
Well, the one change, to be brief enough, much more flexibility. There are so many rules and regulations, we don't have the time to kind of go through all of what those are. There were 3 or 4 superintendents, and I love our new commissioner of education in Missouri. She just started in the last 3 or 4 months. And one of the first things she did, she reached out to 3 or 4 superintendents, small and large, and said, I want to know what are the major issues in urban education, and then we start talking about flexibility. Now, of course, she can't change the federal regulations, but what she can do is change some stuff on the state level to help us have greater flexibility. But Title I, we were so specific, and it was just fascinating to me to see within seconds, people just started drilling down the list. And the closer you are to working with Title I, the more you know those pieces. The other item in terms of just greater flexibility, not only in federal use of funds, but in what's counted on a state level. And I'll give you a very brief example, like for us, for accreditation, and as everyone kind of works with accreditation, we go to school every Monday through Saturday. Our schools are open from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. We give breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but you know what? We can't count the Saturday attendance as part of our attendance numbers. And so we might not meet the 90-90, which is 90% of the kids being in school 90% of the time. I don't know how they came up with that figure. It's kind of crazy. 90%. Now, we have 95% attendance, but if you're tardy, then it gets taken off of the point for the accreditation, if you're tardy. So never mind the kids that work 2 and 3 jobs. So we've just kind of said, okay, what about Saturday school? It's not counted. But guess what? The new commissioner can probably loosen up some of those rules as it relates to accreditation. Those are examples of the kind of flexibility. So I would encourage that every state, and even President Obama, to pull together not only the largest urban superintendents who he has recently met with, but to pull together those that perhaps aren't often heard, that are in the highest poverty environments, rural and urban, and ask, what are the policies that are getting in your way? And for someone like that to hear us, and I believe if he knew them, I believe he would change them. I think it's lack of knowledge.
Okay. Well, let's open this conversation up, and I want to pose the question to everybody, and it follows on to what you were talking about, Tiffany. Do we need more of an emphasis in any educational policies on poverty and its effects? Do we need to actually put more emphasis on things like Title I, boost Title I, or even just have distinctive educational policies which focus on dealing with poverty and its effects?
You know, I think I might step back even farther. Than I think addressing some of the restrictions on Title I are clearly important to districts that depend on Title I. But I would step back and say that the whole funding system for public education needs to be rethought. It's, most school districts get most of their dollars from local property taxes, except in some states where the state pays between 60 and 70% of the cost of public education. And that creates inequities in neighboring districts, particularly the inner rings of a lot of large cities they're really underfunded. And the ripple effects of that in terms of recruiting quality staff, being able to maintain and repair and build new buildings, just goes on. And so I think there's a really core issue of how we fund public education.
I think I would say amen to that. I think we also have to realize what a mismatch we have at the moment between what almost undisputed science tells us, as you were talking about brain development and child development, and where we begin an educational process far too late in the child's life to have the kind of impact, and far too late in the family's life. This whole notion of early childhood education seems to me to be as important as the high school movement was in the early 1900s, in recognizing that where do you need to have an educational process that is part of a public system in which each child is assumed to have equal worth. And by starting at kindergarten at 5 years old, that's just too late. And if we think about, the research, the econometric studies and others are fairly conclusive that this investment, by extending that system to 3- and 4-year-olds and beginning to work with families even at the point of birth, is really has a lot of return if we think of it as an economic investment. So I think we have to think, as Judy says, I think we need to step back and think about the system we're talking about. And certainly financing that system according to local and even state resources is fundamentally at war. We're speaking about wars. Fundamentally at war with the notion that each child comes into a system, a public system, with equal worth and potential. It's just absolutely contrary to it. And then the notion that if we wait till 5 and the low-income children are already 1 to 2 year grades behind, it takes the exceptions rather than building in a system that gives you the rule of success for low-income students. So we have to really step back and say, what kind of education system do we need for students, for children who are, and not only educational system, but what does the education system have to do to also engage to make sure that they're healthy and that the community is involved. I mean, the education is, if we can get the education system right, we will get much of the other kind of economic and social policies to follow, I think.
Well, and to that end, there are many models of success to look from, to learn from, that are have it right, I guess, in so many ways. One of the superintendent of St. Louis Public Schools asked, started talking about college education and why isn't that just a continuation? Just like you go from middle school to high school and just naturally you move on to college. For those that don't know, because many of the people that are watching this might assume that if they are in an environment that has preschool or has tuition-based kindergarten, that in high poverty environments, of course preschool is not paid for in most high poverty environments and certainly not in ours. However, in Jennings we have a preschool at every school because instead we've said, okay, that would be about $60,000, $70,000 a teacher. So that means if I make this class 30 students or so in a class, then let me get a preschool teacher. Again, getting around the issue, but it is, but most of the neighbors around me do not have preschool. PAT was cut, parents as teachers. And so in Jennings, we have PAT. We have one PAT instructor. And guess what? I go to training in 2 weeks. So we'll be doing the home visits together. I mean, it becomes, you have to kind of get around it. But those are examples. That makes no sense why we wouldn't have PAT in early childhood. Now, here's the other piece that I think probably conservatives would argue is that there is a huge issue of accountability. If you're not doing well with the money that you have, why should I give you more? I mean, and that really is an issue. You know, many states have the SIG grants, school improvement grants. Again, system of oppression, in my opinion, in some ways, because the system is the worse that you do, the more money that you'll get. So if you are the lowest and you are a failing school, you're going to get millions of dollars. That makes no sense. And so now that we have improved, in fact, we don't qualify. I literally said, can we get the school improvement grant? We don't qualify because we've improved too much. There's something wrong systematically with how things are set up. And so I think there's an accountability measure and some other pieces. So when you step back even farther than that, so we actually are educating birth through college. We believe we place them. We have 6 counselors, 4 counselors and then 2 extras from the university partners. 6 counselors at a 600 student high school. Isn't that a dream? Most counselors would say that's a dream. And we're a high poverty place. We do that because we must track them into college and through college. And that's when we know we're successful. So we're taking that ownership ourselves. Now every district can't do it or won't do it or perhaps don't have the right people to do it. So I think there's an accountability measure that can be supported on a state and local level, and it has to be.
I think accountability is an issue. I think it's got to be an issue that can only be tied with adequate resources. And that's when you say, it's not, you can understand, if you have adequate resources, then the accountability is on the basis of how you're using the money, not what lack of money or resources you have. Mm-hmm. You know, there are remarkable examples all over the country of people making smart choices under great duration. I was in Carroll County, Mississippi, just not long ago. They have been underfunded from the state formula for a decade. They barely were able to make ends meet with, I think, a balance sheet of less than $50,000 at the end of last year. The superintendent has taken a cut in pay to $18,000 a year in order to be able to fund some things. You know, the buildings are falling down, the roof hasn't been replaced in 50 years, but they also started a 4-year-old program so that those kids who in a Carroll County is mostly low income, so those kids would have a chance not to be behind at the point of kindergarten. And they cut all the things, including the superintendent's salary, just to be able to do that. That's a great heroic story. But it also indicts the system in which they work profoundly. And if you don't hear that story and think the system has to be changed, then you don't get the message, I'm afraid.
It's the same as every time we have one of these billionaire entrepreneurs providing donations to school districts. It's wonderful, but it's also a blight on the system. It's showing that there is a gap and there is a need that's not being addressed.
That's right.
So this is where we're barely scratching the surface in this conversation, but we do want to turn it over to some questions in the audience in a couple of minutes before we break to the second panel. So on your screen right now is a quote from Judy in a recent op-ed that she wrote. And she wrote, "Ignoring poverty in our schools is not the answer. Paying attention to resources and services for the whole child and families and communities is the only way to counteract poverty's devastating effects on children." So I'm going to ask you to sum up by saying or telling us what you think can be done. And I'm going to ask Steve for you to talk about as a society. And Judy, I'm going to turn to you and ask you about what we can do as a sector, as education. And Tiffany, then what we can do as a district. So let's start with you, Steve.
I think as a society, we need to commit ourselves to holding accountable the policymakers in this city and in the state capitals to the fundamental notion that all the great books of our society tell us, which is that a child is born with equal worth. And if we believe that, then we will build an education system. We will insist that policymakers get out of the dysfunction and build an education system that this country is as good as the principles and the beliefs that we hold dearest in our democracy.
Judy?
And I think the education sector should be a big piece of that. I think that one of the things that educators can do is use their voice outside of the classroom. Nobody can tell the story better about what schools need and what kids need than educators who work with them every day. I think that there's a much bigger role for the whole institution of education, teachers, principals, superintendents, families with kids in schools, to speak up for their kids and speak up for what they should have. I'm going to leave it to professional educators like Tiffany to talk about what happens in that school building and during that school day with kids. But I think the voice of kids needs to be spoken by the people who work with them. They can't always say it themselves.
And I think, you know, from a district standpoint, that it's essential that we continue to be the voice, as you have spoken to, as well as insist upon changes being made. Absent of those changes being made from a local or state or national standpoint, we must continue as a district to be creative in how we utilize resources so that needs are met. But at the same time, we must continue to bring the voices to the table. I just say speak truth to power, to insist upon some changes being made if we are going to move together as a nation.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking our first panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of minutes before our break for any questions. If we have questions in the audience, we have a microphone being walked around. We also have questions which can be submitted via Twitter as well with the hashtag WCS15. And if they come in, then our very own Ross will be reading out those questions.
Thank you so much to the panel for bringing up these very critical issues. My name is Robert Mahaffey. I'm with the Rural School and Community Trust. We represent the 12 million rural children. 40% of them live in poverty. Title I has come up in a number of your comments. There's a bill in Congress that would look at the bracket system in Title I, and I don't want to dig into the formulas very much, but the reality is that Title I disproportionately moves funds to large population poverty communities. So equal levels of poverty with low populations of kids get significantly less dollars. And we're talking about rural children across the country. It's a difficult piece of legislation to move, to change those brackets so that it's based on poverty, not just population size, would make a significant difference, and it wouldn't pit urban poverty against rural poverty. Your thoughts on this?
From my perspective, and actually and I mentioned doing the little Google, that's the first thing that'll come up. It'll be the formula and how that, you know, the divisors in that formula, dividing the poverty rate from the population, which allows for districts with larger populations to get more funds. I agree completely with you in that system can be changed. I don't know enough about the bracket system and what that will look like and what some unintended consequences could be. But certainly it's better than what we are working with now in terms of addressing title in a more equitable fashion. But the funding formula for all of our states, which are different, whether you're in Virginia or DC or Missouri, needs to be fixed as well. So even places that are not high title, whether they're rural or urban, also have some disparities with their high poverty students and what can be used. And so the title is just one example of many, but the foundation formula overall, I think, is something that needs to be addressed. As a total side note from that, when you're addressing all of those things, things like mental health at every school. We do eyeglass checks at every school and hearing, why in the world don't we have a mental health person at every school? In Jennings, we do, because we've partnered. We have 1 or 2 mental health, but shouldn't that be a mandate? So there's so many mandates that we must ask for and really demand to be met in short order, or the conversations will continue. And the ideas are out there. They're just not acted upon. Decades ago, you can see some of these ideas that are out there.
Hi, Luann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. Tiffany, thank you for bringing up mental health, because I see that as a huge issue, even in wealthy suburban counties. How did you afford all the counselors? That's one thing that we don't see. What did you give up in your high schools to get all those counselors? You had to give up something, I imagine, so I was just curious how you were able to do that.
Well, and we, in Jennings, when I started there, they had a deficit. We now have had a surplus for 3 years. This is my 3rd year. So we'll end this year with a small surplus of $12,000 or so. So, you know, while it's small, it shows that this can be done, but in ways that are absolutely pretty ridiculous, as the example that was given. So in my district, it's myself, and I have 1 assistant superintendent. So when I started, everybody retired. The curriculum people were retiring before I started, so I didn't hire curriculum people. I do that. I have a director of HR, director of facilities, director of finance. That's it. I do have a director of secondary, but his office is in the high school, so he can really assist the principal in areas. That is not how schools should be operating on a streamlined budget. It's why I wear the tennis shoes. I do crossing guard duty every morning and every afternoon. So I literally flew in here for this, and I'll be flying out right after this so I can get back to the duties that aren't done. So it's people having 10 jobs in a district so that you can funnel money to the classroom, because money is not being given for classrooms in ways that they should. So either you complain about the fact that money's not being given, or you get really creative and you streamline your budget. The other thing that we do, you know, for us, every month our principals come and they meet with me, because this isn't something you learn in principal school or superintendent school. So every month they meet with me and we have a data consultation, and they have to justify every penny that they spent. That will save a lot of dollars for every superintendent that's out there. The crazy thing is, the farther you get away from the classroom and teaching, because we're all teachers, the more layers of bureaucracy and the more you forget what you need to do to have great things going on in classrooms, and you need to support your teachers and be in the classrooms. That's how you make these things happen. So we choose to fund counselors. And I'm sure there are myriad of things we chose over the years not to fund in order to make that happen. 2 of the counselors one comes from Mizzou as a partnership college, and 1 comes from Harris Stowe, but the 4 are funded by us for the 600 students. And for anyone that knows schools, 6 counselors for a 600 student school, that's a lot. And we're going to be adding another one next year.